boys are the answer. The long...
I sort of like you three. Off one!
One for all.
Nah, and again, I need to hear it louder. Off one!
And one for all!
The only guarantee you have as a human being, if you're lucky, you get to choose how you spend those last moments.
I keep hoping that part gets easier.
That's what I'm afraid of.
Maintain a speed of 3 miles per hour.
Walk?
Until there's only one of you left. Who's ready to fucking win?
In Dublin, where the girls are so pretty,
I look at each and every one of you, and I see hope.
I first set my eyes on sweet Molly alone.
Personally, I can't stop thinking about it.
I have everything to do, and that's why I'm here.
Nobody wanted more than me. This is my chance to change things.
You don't think about making it to the end? Just making it to... It matters, man.
You're right. Every moment matters, especially at the end.
What, walk me a while?
Yeah.
You boys are the answer.
The road in the long walk does not just stretch across America. It stretches across fear, pain, survival, youth, politics, and the terrifying idea that society can turn suffering into entertainment. Before the first gunshot is fired, before the first boy collapses on the highway, the movie already creates a heavy feeling in the chest. You know something horrible is waiting ahead, but you keep walking with these characters anyway. That is the power of this story. It takes a simple concept, teenage boys forced to walk forever until only one survives, and turns it into something emotional, cruel, thoughtful, and deeply human. The film immediately feels different from most modern dystopian movies. It is not built around giant explosions or superhero moments. Instead, it focuses on conversation, silence, breathing, sweat, fear, and exhaustion. Every mile matters, every step matters. The audience slowly realizes that the real horror is not just death. The real horror is watching young people become entertainment for crowds who clap while children destroy themselves. The 2025 adaptation carries enormous pressure because the original novel by Stephen King has been respected for decades. Fans waited years to see a proper film version. Many people believed the story was unfilmable because so much of its power comes from inner thoughts and emotional tension instead of action scenes. But the movie manages to capture the emotional nightmare by staying close to the characters and allowing viewers to feel the endless exhaustion of the walk itself. One of the smartest decisions in the movie is the casting. The young actors do not feel like polished Hollywood heroes, they feel real. They look nervous, awkward, tired, angry, confused, and human. That realism helps the audience connect to them immediately. The movie understands that if viewers do not care about the walkers, the story fails completely. The lead performance carries the emotional center of the film. The main character begins the journey with quiet confidence, almost believing he can outlast everyone else. But the road changes him mile by mile. His body weakens while his mind becomes sharper and darker. The actor portrays this transformation carefully. At first, he jokes with the others, smiles at fans on the roadside, and acts brave. Later, his eyes become hollow. His face loses warmth, his voice becomes slower. The audience watches innocence slowly disappear. The supporting cast gives the movie its heart. Every walker represents a different type of teenager and a different reaction to fear. One boy uses humor to survive mentally. Another becomes aggressive and paranoid. One tries to make friendships because he cannot face death alone. Another refuses emotional attachment because he knows everyone around him will eventually die. These personalities clash naturally throughout the story, creating emotional tension stronger than many action sequences. The chemistry between the actors becomes one of the movie's biggest strengths. Conversations feel spontaneous instead of scripted. When the walkers joke with each other, it sounds like real teenagers trying to distract themselves from terror. When arguments happen, they feel ugly and emotional instead of cinematic and stylish. The film never forgets that these are children trapped inside a horrifying system. The development process for the movie was long and complicated. For many years, different studios tried to adapt the novel. Some directors wanted to turn it into a giant action film, others wanted to make it darker and more psychological. The biggest challenge was finding the correct tone. If the movie became too flashy, it would lose the emotional sadness that makes the story powerful. If it became too slow, mainstream audiences might lose interest. Eventually, the filmmakers realized the movie needed balance. It had to feel tense and cinematic while still remaining intimate and character driven. That balance defines the final product. The movie includes shocking violence and suspense, but it never treats death like entertainment. Every loss feels painful. The screenplay adaptation also faced difficult choices. The original story spends a lot of time inside the minds of the walkers. Translating internal thoughts into visual storytelling is always difficult in cinema. Instead of relying heavily on narration, the film uses facial expressions, body language, pauses, and subtle dialogue to reveal emotional states. Long stretches of walking become strangely hypnotic. The audience begins noticing tiny changes in posture and breathing patterns because survival depends on physical endurance. The production design deserves enormous praise because it creates a believable alternate America without overwhelming the story. The country in the long walk feels familiar but deeply unsettling. Crowds cheer for suffering. Military vehicles follow the walkers constantly. Citizens gather along roadsides like they are attending a parade. The world does not look futuristic in an exaggerated science fiction way. Instead, it feels disturbingly possible. That realism makes the horror stronger. The audience can imagine this society existing only a few steps away from reality. The movie quietly asks dangerous questions. Would people actually watch children suffer if society normalized it? Would governments use entertainment to control fear and frustration? Would audiences slowly stop caring about human pain if violence became tradition? The filming style supports the emotional tone perfectly. The camera often stays close to the walkers, creating a feeling of physical exhaustion. Viewers almost feel the heat, sweat, and soreness themselves. Wide shots are used carefully to remind audiences how endless the road truly is. Sometimes the walkers appear tiny against massive highways and crowds, emphasizing how powerless they really are. The cinematography becomes darker as the story progresses. Early scenes contain brighter daylight and more open space. Later sections feel colder and more claustrophobic, even though the characters are still outdoors. This visual shift reflects the psychological collapse happening inside the group. One of the film's most haunting achievements is its use of pacing. Many movies fear silence and constant movement. The long walk embraces slowness, certain scenes linger longer than expected, the audience is forced to sit with discomfort instead of escaping it. The repetitive sound of footsteps becomes almost unbearable over time. That repetition is intentional. The movie wants viewers to feel trapped alongside the walkers. The sound design plays a massive role in creating tension. Small noises become terrifying. Heavy breathing, boots scraping pavement, distant gunshots, helicopters overhead, military radios, and crowds screaming all blend together into a nightmare atmosphere. The absence of music in some scenes becomes just as powerful as the soundtrack itself. When the musical score finally rises during emotional moments, it hits hard. The composer avoids overwhelming orchestral heroism. Instead, the music feels mournful and intimate. Piano melodies and soft strings dominate much of the score. Tense scenes often use restrained music because the filmmakers trust the emotional power of silence. One unforgettable aspect of the soundtrack is how it changes during moments of psychological collapse. Sometimes the music becomes distorted or distant, almost like the characters are losing touch with reality. This technique helps the audience understand the mental destruction caused by exhaustion and trauma. The physical performances from the actors become increasingly impressive as the movie progresses. Their bodies genuinely look weaker over time. Their movements become less stable, their conversations grow slower and more emotional. Whether through method acting, physical conditioning, makeup, or all three combined, the film successfully sells the brutal endurance challenge. The emotional center of the movie comes from friendship. That may sound strange for such a cruel story, but it is true. The walkers slowly form emotional connections because they are facing death together. These bonds make later tragedies devastating. The audience knows many of these boys will not survive, but the film still encourages attachment because that attachment is the entire point. One particularly powerful relationship develops between two walkers with opposite personalities. One remains hopeful while the other becomes cynical and bitter. Their conversations slowly reveal fears about family, masculinity, failure, and mortality. They begin understanding each other despite their differences. This emotional connection gives the movie warmth even during its darkest moments. The film also explores how competition destroys humanity. The walkers technically need each other emotionally, but only one can survive. That contradiction creates constant tension. Sometimes characters help each other, other times they secretly hope another boy will collapse first. The movie examines how survival situations distort morality. The crowd scenes are especially disturbing because ordinary citizens behave casually while witnessing unimaginable suffering. Some spectators cheer loudly like sports fans, others treat the event like a family outing. Children wave signs while walkers struggle to stay alive. These moments created one of the film's strongest themes society's ability to normalize cruelty. The military presence throughout the film adds another layer of fear. Soldiers follow the walkers, constantly representing cold authority and absolute rules. They rarely show emotion. The system values obedience over compassion. This coldness reflects the dystopian political atmosphere surrounding the event. The film avoids giving easy political answers, but its themes are obvious. It criticizes authoritarian culture, public obsession with violent entertainment, and systems that sacrifice young people for spectacle. Yet it never becomes preachy. The emotional storytelling naturally delivers these ideas without long speeches. Fans of the original novel noticed that the adaptation respects the source material while making necessary cinematic adjustments. Some scenes are expanded to deepen relationships between characters. Certain conversations are modernized slightly for contemporary audiences, but the core emotional truth remains intact. The release of the movie created strong online discussion almost immediately. Many viewers compared it to dystopian franchises like The Hunger Games, but longtime fans argued that The Long Walk feels more grounded and emotionally devastating. Unlike larger franchise films focused on rebellion and spectacle, this movie feels painfully intimate. Social media reactions exploded after opening weekend. Viewers discussed specific emotional scenes, shocking deaths, and philosophical questions raised by the story. Many people said the movie stayed in their minds long after leaving the theater. That lingering emotional effect became one of the biggest compliments the film received. Memes also appeared quickly online, though many carried dark humor reflecting the movie's themes. Internet users joked about exhaustion, endless walking, school stress, and emotional survival. Some memes compared everyday struggles to surviving the walk itself. Others focused on the brutal rules of the competition. Like many intense modern films, the internet transformed painful scenes into ironic humor almost immediately. At the same time, serious analysis videos and discussions flooded online platforms. People debated the meaning of the ending, the symbolism of the road, and the psychological breakdowns experienced by different characters. The movie encouraged interpretation because it refuses simplistic answers. Critics largely praised the film for its emotional maturity and disciplined filmmaking. Many reviewers appreciated that it trusted audiences instead of relying on constant action. Performances received especially strong praise. Several critics highlighted how difficult it is to make walking visually compelling for an entire movie, yet the film succeeds through tension and character work. Some criticisms did emerge. A few viewers felt the pacing was too slow during the middle sections. Others wished the political world building had been explored more deeply. Some audiences expecting a traditional thriller found the movie more emotional and reflective than anticipated. But even many mixed reviews acknowledged the film's ambition. The box office performance became an interesting story itself. The movie was not designed as a massive superhero level blockbuster, but strong word of mouth helped it gain momentum. Younger audiences connected with its themes of pressure, competition, and emotional burnout. Older audiences appreciated its serious tone and character driven storytelling. Internationally, the film also performed well because its themes are universal: fear, survival, government control, media spectacle, and youth anxiety resonate across cultures. The story's simplicity helps it travel globally. Anyone can understand the terror of being forced to continue forward while physically and emotionally collapsing. One reason the film connects so strongly with modern audiences is its relevance to current culture. Many young people already feel trapped inside endless systems of pressure. School pressure, career pressure, online performance culture, and economic stress create feelings similar to emotional endurance contests. The movie taps directly into that exhaustion. Some viewers interpreted the walk itself as a metaphor for modern life. Society constantly tells people to keep moving, keep performing, keep competing, and never slow down. Falling behind can feel socially deadly. The film turns that emotional reality into literal physical horror. The movie also explores masculinity in fascinating ways. These boys are expected to appear tough, fearless, and emotionally controlled even while facing death. Some characters embrace toxic ideas of strength. Others slowly open up emotionally because survival strips away social masks. The story quietly criticizes cultural expectations placed on young men. The performances become especially heartbreaking during scenes where characters discuss home and family. The walkers slowly realize they may never return to normal life. Conversations about parents, girlfriends, childhood memories, and dreams become devastating because audiences know most of these futures will disappear forever. The ending of the film leaves viewers emotionally shaken. Without spoiling details, The final moments refuse easy comfort. The story stays true to its bleak emotional core while still delivering powerful cinematic impact. The conclusion feels tragic, surreal, and strangely inevitable. One reason the ending works so well is because the movie earns it emotionally. The audience has spent so much time suffering alongside the walkers that the final moments feel overwhelming instead of manipulative. Exhaustion becomes part of the viewing experience itself. The director deserves enormous credit for maintaining emotional control throughout the film. A weaker version could have become melodramatic or exploitative. Instead, the movie remains grounded even during shocking scenes. Violence is horrifying rather than entertaining. Emotional moments feel earned rather than forced. The adaptation also benefits from modern filmmaking technology without depending on it excessively. Visual effects are used carefully to enhance realism instead of dominating scenes. Practical filmmaking techniques keep the movie physically grounded. Audiences believe these characters are genuinely walking endless miles. Costumey design subtly supports character development as well. Clothes become dirtier, wetter, and more damaged over time. Small physical details show the progression of exhaustion. Sweating faces, blistered feet, trembling hands, and deteriorating posture all help sell the nightmare reality. The film's emotional realism may become its greatest legacy. Many dystopian stories focus primarily on plot mechanics. The Long Walk focuses on emotional deterioration. The audience experiences fear, grief, numbness, hope, guilt, and despair alongside the characters. That emotional immersion makes the story unforgettable. The movie also succeeds because it respects intelligence. It does not over explain themes constantly. Symbolism emerges naturally through storytelling. The road itself becomes many things at once: death, adulthood, competition, capitalism, war, entertainment, and human endurance. Some viewers interpreted the film spiritually as well. The endless walk resembles purgatory or a journey through suffering toward uncertain meaning. Hallucinations and mental breakdowns later in the film create dream-like qualities that deepen this interpretation. The internet's reaction to the characters became especially intense. Fans chose favorite walkers and debated who they related to most emotionally. Online communities analyze personality types, survival strategies, and emotional arcs. Certain lines of dialogue became heavily quoted across social media. The emotional pain of losing characters became a major talking point online. Because the film spends time developing relationships carefully, deaths feel personal rather than disposable. Audiences mourn specific walkers almost like real people. The movie's release also revived interest in the original novel. New readers discovered the story for the first time, while longtime fans returned to compare both versions. Discussions about differences between book and film became common across fan communities. One fascinating element of the adaptation is how modern it feels despite the source material being decades old. The fears inside the story remain painfully relevant. Media obsession, political extremism, emotional isolation, and social pressure still dominate contemporary life. The film's success may influence future dystopian adaptations. Hollywood often chases giant spectacle franchises, but The Long Walk proves audiences still appreciate quieter, psychologically intense storytelling. Its focus on character and atmosphere over explosions helps it stand apart. The emotional exhaustion created by the movie becomes strangely addictive. Many viewers described feeling mentally drained after watching it but still unable to stop thinking about it. That lingering psychological effect reflects the story's power. Even small scenes become memorable because of strong dialogue and performance work. Casual conversations about food, memories, fear, or dreams suddenly carry enormous emotional weight when survival is uncertain. The film understands that ordinary human moments become extraordinary under extreme pressure. The use of weather and environment also strengthens the story. Rain, heat, darkness, and changing landscapes constantly affect the walkers physically and emotionally. Nature itself feels indifferent to human suffering, adding another layer of bleakness. The road functions almost like a character. It never ends. It stretches endlessly forward no matter how exhausted the walkers become. The highway represents unstoppable systems larger than individual people. No matter how much pain exists, the walk continues. By the final act. Audiences understand that the true horror is not simply death, the true horror is dehumanization. The walkers slowly become symbols, entertainment products, and statistics instead of children. Fighting to maintain humanity becomes more important than winning. The movie's emotional honesty is what elevates it beyond simple dystopian entertainment. It understands fear deeply. It understands loneliness deeply. Most importantly, it understands how young people search for meaning while trapped inside systems they cannot control. Years from now, many viewers will probably remember specific emotional moments more than action scenes, a quiet conversation during exhaustion, a terrified smile, a sudden breakdown, a final glance between friends. Those human details give the film lasting power. The Long Walk ultimately becomes more than an adaptation, it becomes a reflection of modern anxiety itself. The pressure to continue moving forward no matter the cost feels painfully familiar to contemporary audiences. That emotional truth makes the movie resonate far beyond its dystopian setting. The film leaves viewers with disturbing questions that do not disappear easily. How much suffering will society tolerate if entertainment is involved? How far will systems push young people before collapse becomes inevitable? What happens when survival itself becomes performance? Continuing from where the story's emotional weight leaves off, the aftermath of the long walk is not something that simply fades when the credits roll. The film's impact continues like a slow echo, almost like footsteps still heard long after the walkers have disappeared down the road. It is not just a story that ends, it is a feeling that lingers uncomfortable and reflective, as if the audience themselves has been part of the march. One of the most discussed aspects after release is how the film handles its final emotional stretch without turning it into a typical Hollywood conclusion. There is no clean relief, no easy reward, and no comforting message that everything will be okay. Instead, the movie leans into the idea that systems like the long walk do not produce winners in a traditional sense. Even the so called victory feels hollow, shaped by loss, trauma, and emotional collapse. This decision divided audiences but also gave the film its strongest identity. It refuses to lie to the viewer for comfort. The final scenes become a quiet meditation on endurance. The camera does not rush. It stays close to the remaining walkers, letting silence speak louder than dialogue. Breathing becomes heavier, steps become slower, even the crowd noise in the background feels distant, almost meaningless. At this point, the audience understands that the real journey is no longer physical. It has become psychological survival. After release, critics and viewers began focusing heavily on the symbolic meaning of the walk itself. Many interpretations emerged. Some saw it as a critique of capitalism, where people are forced to compete endlessly until only one survives while others are discarded. Others viewed it as a reflection of military systems and authoritarian control, where obedience is valued above human life. Another interpretation saw it as a metaphor for fame culture, where young people are pushed into public consumption, judged constantly, and emotionally destroyed for entertainment. What made these interpretations stronger is that the film does not confirm any single meaning. Instead, it leaves space for the audience to project their own fears into the story. This ambiguity is one of the reasons the movie stayed relevant in online discussions long after its release. The performances continue to be analyzed in detail. Viewers especially praised how the actors managed to maintain emotional authenticity while portraying extreme physical exhaustion. Small details became talking points online. Trembling hands during conversations, forced smiles during moments of fear, or the subtle way characters begin avoiding eye contact as death becomes more likely. These micro expressions carried more emotional weight than any dialogue heavy scene. A lot of discussion also focused on how friendships in the film change over time. At the beginning, relationships are formed out of convenience and survival instinct. But as the walk continues, those relationships deepen into something more fragile and meaningful. The tragedy comes from knowing that connection itself becomes painful. Caring about someone increases suffering because loss becomes inevitable. The film quietly suggests that emotional attachment is both the most human and most dangerous thing in the walk. Behind the scenes, reports from production highlighted how physically demanding the shoot was. The actors reportedly spent long days walking real roads and outdoor environments to capture authenticity. The production team avoided artificial shortcuts whenever possible. This decision gave the film its grounded feeling but also made filming extremely exhausting for the cast. That real fatigue is visible on screen and adds to the realism. Director's approach to pacing remained one of the most debated creative choices. Some audiences felt the slow rhythm made the movie more powerful because it mirrored the actual experience of exhaustion. Others felt it tested patience too far. But even critics who questioned the pacing often admitted that it served the story's purpose. The discomfort was intentional. The audience was not meant to feel entertained in a traditional way. They were meant to feel worn down, just like the characters. Music continued to play a subtle but important role in audience interpretation. After release, the soundtrack gained attention on streaming platforms, especially the quieter piano themes. Listeners described the music as emotionally heavy and strangely calming but sad at the same time. Many fans associated specific tracks with particular character moments, turning the soundtrack into an emotional memory map of the film. Online communities quickly turned The Long Walk into a subject of analysis, videos, essays, and discussions. One popular topic was the psychology of competition under life threatening pressure. Viewers debated how different personalities adapt to extreme stress. Some break down quickly, some become emotionally detached, while others use humor as a coping mechanism. The film unintentionally became a study of human psychological survival under impossible conditions. Memes continued to spread, but they evolved over time. At first, they focused on dark humor about walking endlessly or being tired of life responsibilities. Later, they became more reflective, referencing emotional scenes and friendships from the film. Some memes even use silence or empty roads as symbolic humor about burnout culture. The internet transformed the movie into both comedy and emotional commentary at the same time. Box office discussions also revealed something interesting. The film did not rely on massive opening weekend hype like typical blockbusters. Instead, it grew steadily through word of mouth. People recommended it not as a fun movie but as an experience. This type of marketing is rare in modern cinema and shows how strongly the emotional impact resonated with audiences. International audiences reacted differently but still strongly. In some regions, viewers connected the story to educational pressure and youth competition systems. In others, it was linked to political control or media exploitation. Despite cultural differences, the emotional core remained universally understood. The fear of being forced to continue suffering while others watch. Film analysts also noted how the movie uses repetition as a storytelling tool. The constant act of walking becomes symbolic repetition of life itself. Wake up, move forward, endure pressure, repeat. The film exaggerates this idea to extreme levels, turning routine survival into literal punishment. Over time, this repetition becomes almost hypnotic, making viewers question their own daily cycles. Some of the most powerful scenes discussed online are not the deaths or dramatic moments, but the quiet pauses in between. A walker adjusting his shoe, another staring at the horizon without speaking. A short exchange of words that carries deeper meaning than expected. These moments remind audiences that life continues even under extreme conditions and that humanity does not disappear instantly, it fades slowly. The film's influence also reached discussions about modern dystopian storytelling. Many critics compared it to earlier dystopian films, but pointed out that The Long Walk feels more intimate and less focused on rebellion. There is no revolution arc. There is no grand resistance movement, there is only endurance and survival. That simplicity makes it feel more grounded and emotionally direct. Another topic that emerged after release was the idea of spectatorship. The film forces viewers to question their own role as observers. Just like the in world audience watching the walkers, real world audiences are also watching suffering unfold on screen. This uncomfortable reflection adds another layer to the experience. The movie quietly asks, why are we watching this and what does that say about us? The ending, while tragic, also sparked philosophical debate. Some viewers saw it as nihilistic, suggesting that suffering has no meaning. Others saw it as deeply human, arguing that meaning is found in the connections formed during suffering, not in the outcome. This dual interpretation kept discussions alive for months after release. Even small production details became points of interest. Costume dirt progression, changing weather continuity, and subtle makeup effects were analyzed by fans frame by frame. The attention to detail reinforced the belief that the film was carefully crafted to maintain realism at every level. The legacy of The Long Walk is still developing, but early reactions suggest it will be remembered as a rare kind of dystopian film, one that prioritizes emotional truth over spectacle. It does not try to excite the audience. It tries to exhaust them emotionally in a controlled, meaningful way. In the end, what stays with the viewer is not the rules of the walk nor the mechanics of the system, but the faces of the boys who kept moving forward despite knowing the cost. Their fear, friendship, frustration, and fading hope become the real story. As the discussion around the long walk continued to grow, the film slowly shifted from being just a release into something closer to a cultural reference point. People stopped describing it only as a movie and started using it as a way to talk about pressure, burnout, and survival in everyday life. That kind of shift is rare. It means the story has moved beyond its original frame and started living inside conversations about reality. One of the strongest reasons for this lasting impact is how the film treats time. Time in the story does not feel like normal cinematic time. It feels stretched, heavy, and repetitive. Minutes feel like hours, hours feel like days. The audience experiences this distortion alongside the walkers. This manipulation of time is not just a storytelling trick, it becomes a psychological experience. Many viewers described feeling physically tired after watching as if they had actually been walking with the characters. This sense of shared exhaustion is one of the film's most unusual achievements. Instead of simply showing suffering, it tries to transfer that feeling to the audience. That is why even simple scenes, like adjusting posture, drinking water, or taking a step forward, feel significant. The film trains the viewer to pay attention to survival level details. Another major point of analysis was the way authority is portrayed. The figures controlling the long walk are rarely emotional. They do not explain themselves in depth, nor do they show visible doubt. Their calmness is more disturbing than aggression. It suggests a system that no longer needs justification. It simply exists, continues, and demands obedience. This cold structure becomes one of the most frightening elements of the entire narrative. Audiences also paid attention to how the film handles sound when authority appears on screen. The tone often shifts slightly, background noise becomes sharper, silence becomes heavier, and even footsteps feel more controlled. These subtle audio choices reinforce the feeling that the walkers are constantly being observed and measured. A recurring theme in discussions after release was the idea of chosen suffering. The walkers technically volunteer for the long walk, but the film carefully questions how voluntary that choice really is. Economic pressure, social expectations, and personal desperation all influence their decision. This raises uncomfortable questions about real life systems where people feel they have no real alternative choices, even when participation is technically optional. The emotional structure of the film also became a major point of praise. Instead of building toward constant highs and lows, it creates a slow emotional erosion. Happiness does not disappear in a single moment, it fades gradually. Hope does not break suddenly, it weakens over time. This slow breakdown feels more realistic than traditional dramatic storytelling. One of the most heartbreaking elements is how humor is used inside the story. Early in the walk, jokes are frequent. The boys laugh, tease each other, and try to act normal. But as exhaustion grows, humor becomes rarer and more fragile. When laughter does appear later, it often feels forced or slightly broken. The film uses this shift to show how even coping mechanisms collapse under sustained pressure. The character writing continues to be one of the most analyzed aspects of the movie. Each walker is not just a personality but a response to fear. Some become controlling because they fear chaos. Some become quiet because they fear emotional attachment. Some become overly friendly because they fear loneliness more than death. These psychological patterns make the group feel like a small ecosystem of survival strategies. One particularly discussed idea is how the film portrays identity loss. As the walk continues, characters begin to lose their individual sense of self. Names matter less, backstories fade into the background, the only thing that remains is endurance. The film subtly shows how extreme systems can reduce human identity down to a single function: keep moving or stop forever. This idea connects strongly with modern audiences, especially younger viewers. Many people related the film to academic pressure, job competition, and social media performance culture. In these environments, identity often becomes tied to productivity or visibility. The movie exaggerates this idea into a literal survival scenario, but the emotional connection remains clear. Another layer of discussion focused on the moral choices inside the walk. Characters are constantly forced into ethical decisions that have no correct answer. Helping someone might risk your own survival. Ignoring someone might preserve your chance to continue. The film does not judge these choices. Instead, it shows how morality becomes unstable when survival is at stake. This moral instability is one of the reasons the film feels so uncomfortable. It does not allow the audience to stay morally distant. Viewers begin to wonder what they would do in similar conditions. That self questioning is part of the emotional design. As time passed after release, interviews and behind the scenes discussions revealed more about the physical toll of filming. The constant walking, outdoor exposure, and emotional intensity reportedly left the cast genuinely exhausted during production. This real fatigue contributed to the authenticity of the performances. The actors were not just pretending to be tired, were experiencing a controlled version of it. The production team also made deliberate choices to avoid over stylization. Lighting often feels natural rather than dramatic. Camera movement stays simple and observational. Even in intense moments, the film avoids excessive visual effects. This restraint helps maintain realism and keeps attention focused on human expression rather than cinematic spectacle. Sound design again plays a crucial role in emotional storytelling. One of the most effective techniques is the gradual reduction of environmental richness. Early in the film, the world sounds full wind, distant voices, movement, life. Later, sound becomes thinner and more isolated. This creates the feeling that the world itself is shrinking around the walkers. After its release, some critics describe the film as anti spectacle dystopia. Unlike many dystopian films that rely on rebellion arcs or dramatic world building reveals, this film stays grounded in personal endurance. The system is not explained in detail because it does not need to be. The walkers are not trying to understand it, they are trying to survive it. Online discussions also highlighted how the film avoids clear villains. While authority exists as a controlling force, the emotional focus is not on fighting them. Instead, the focus is on the walkers themselves and their internal struggles. This absence of a traditional antagonist shifts the story from conflict based drama to endurance based tragedy. The emotional reaction from audiences remained strong long after release. Many people reported that certain scenes replayed in their minds unexpectedly. Not because they were shocking in a conventional sense, but because they were emotionally quiet and realistic. A simple moment of hesitation or a look between characters often left a deeper impression than violent scenes. The film's influence on online culture also expanded beyond memes. It began appearing in discussions about burnout, education systems, and mental health. People used its imagery, endless roads, tired footsteps, silent endurance, as metaphors for their own lives. That transformation from fiction into emotional language is part of what gives the film lasting relevance. Some viewers also connected the story to historical and real world endurance events, though the film itself remains fictional. These comparisons were not about direct parallels but about recognizing the universal fear of forced endurance and public suffering. The final emotional takeaway many viewers expressed is not sadness alone but recognition. The film reflects something familiar in modern life, the feeling of continuing forward even when exhaustion becomes overwhelming because stopping feels impossible. That emotional recognition is what makes the story difficult to forget. Even weeks after watching, audiences often find themselves thinking about specific characters, wondering about their imagined futures outside the walk. This is ironic because the story itself denies most of those futures. Yet the human mind naturally resists finality, especially when it comes to emotionally developed characters. That resistance is part of why the film stays alive in conversation. It does not allow emotional closure, it leaves space for imagination, grief, and interpretation. Ultimately, The Long Walk becomes less about its plot and more about its emotional effect. It is a story about movement without escape, endurance without guarantee, and humanity under continuous pressure. It strips away spectacle to reveal something more uncomfortable. The quiet collapse that happens when stopping is not an option. As the conversation around the long walk kept expanding, another layer started to emerge in audience interpretation. The idea that the film is not only about endurance under pressure, but also about how systems quietly train people to accept that pressure as normal. The long walk is extreme in its rules, but emotionally, It reflects something more familiar: how competition, visibility, and performance can become constant states of existence. This is why many viewers began connecting the film to their own routines, not in a literal sense but in a psychological one. The walkers are forced to keep going or die. In real life, people are not physically forced in that way, but the emotional sensation of I can't stop or I fall behind is something many recognize. The movie exaggerates that feeling until it becomes unbearable to watch, and that exaggeration is what makes it so effective. Another detail that gained attention over time is how silence is used as a narrative language. Silence in this film is never empty, it carries weight. When characters stop talking, it is not relief, it is exhaustion, fear, or emotional shutdown. The absence of dialogue becomes a form of communication itself. Viewers learn to interpret posture, breathing, and spacing between walkers as emotional signals. One of the most discussed aspects in fan analysis is how relationships in the film are constantly under threat from time itself. In most stories, relationships are threatened by outside conflict. Here, relationships are threatened simply by continuation. Every step forward increases the probability of separation. This creates a strange emotional tension where closeness and loss grow together instead of opposing each other. The film also subtly explores memory. As exhaustion increases, characters begin forgetting details about their own lives or becoming less certain when they speak about the past. Memories that once felt stable become fragile. This adds another layer of horror. Not only are they losing the future, but the past is also becoming unstable. In many discussions, viewers pointed out that the film avoids romanticizing strength. Physical toughness does not guarantee survival, and emotional openness does not guarantee weakness. Instead, survival feels random, shaped by timing, luck, and unpredictable collapse. This rejection of earned victory storytelling makes the film feel more realistic but also more emotionally unsettling. One of the most powerful visual ideas in the movie is how the road itself gradually becomes indistinguishable from everything else. At the beginning, the environment feels structured, clearly defined roads, open skies, visible crowds. Later, everything blends together. The road, the horizon, and exhaustion begin to merge visually and emotionally. The walkers are no longer traveling through space, they are trapped inside it. The audience reaction to this visual progression was strong because it mirrors psychological burnout. When people become exhausted in real life, environments can begin to feel repetitive or flattened. The film translates that sensation into cinematic form. Another major topic of discussion was the role of the spectators. The crowd is not just background, it represents society's shifting relationship with suffering. At times, the crowd feels excited. At other times, they are quiet observers. Occasionally, their presence feels almost ritualistic, as if watching is an expected civic duty. This ambiguity makes the crowd more unsettling than any individual antagonist. Some viewers interpreted the spectators as a reflection of media consumption itself. People watch intense emotional content, then move on quickly to the next thing. The film does not accuse the audience directly, but it forces reflection by placing viewers in the same position as the fictional crowd. The emotional pacing of the film continues to be one of its defining traits. Instead of escalating continuously, the film moves in waves of tension and release. However, each release becomes weaker over time. Relief moments still exist, but they feel shorter and more fragile. This gradual weakening of emotional recovery mirrors real psychological fatigue. As more interviews and discussions surfaced after release, the creative team emphasized that the goal was never to create a traditional survival thriller. The intention was to build an emotional endurance experience. The difference is important. A thriller focuses on what happens next. This film focuses on how long it can continue happening. The actors' performances were repeatedly highlighted in critical discussions because they maintain emotional consistency even as physical exhaustion increases. The transition from early confidence to late stage emotional collapse is not sudden. It is gradual and almost unnoticeable until it becomes undeniable. That slow transformation makes the characters feel real rather than constructed. Online discussions also began focusing on how the film handles masculinity under pressure. The walkers are mostly young men and they are constantly performing strength even when breaking down internally. The film shows how emotional vulnerability and forced toughness collide. Some characters embrace silence to appear strong. Others openly struggle and are punished socially within the group dynamic. This tension creates one of the film's quietest but most important themes: the cost of emotional suppression. The longer the walk continues, the harder it becomes for characters to express fear directly. Eventually, emotional expression itself becomes dangerous because it signals weakness. Another aspect that viewers found striking is how the film treats hope. Hope is not completely removed from the story, but it becomes unstable. At times, characters believe survival is possible. At other times, hope disappears entirely. The film does not treat hope as a constant force. Instead, it shows it as something that flickers under extreme pressure. This instability of hope contributes heavily to the emotional intensity of the final act. When hope is no longer stable, every step forward feels uncertain. The audience is no longer watching toward an outcome, they are watching toward collapse. The legacy of The Long Walk also includes how it changed the way some viewers think about endurance storytelling. After watching, many people found other films in the genre felt faster, more stylized, or less emotionally grounded. This movie created a reference point for what slow psychological survival storytelling can look like when fully committed to realism. It also influenced conversations about adaptation fidelity. Fans of the original novel debated how closely the film captured the emotional tone of the source material versus its narrative structure. While some differences were noted, most agreed that the emotional essence, the feeling of relentless forward motion under impossible pressure, was preserved. As time passes, the film continues to be revisited not for entertainment but for emotional reflection. People return to specific scenes when discussing stress, endurance, or mental fatigue in general life contexts. It has become a kind of emotional metaphor library where imagery from the film is used to describe real feelings. Even its quietest moments have gained symbolic meaning. A single step forward becomes a symbol of persistence. A pause becomes a symbol of fragility. A conversation becomes a symbol of temporary human connection inside an unstable system. These meanings were not always explicit in the film, but they emerged through repeated viewing and discussion. In the end, what continues to define The Long Walk is not its plot mechanics or dystopian structure, but its emotional consistency. It commits fully to one idea and refuses to soften it. That continuous movement under pressure changes people in irreversible ways. And even after analysis, interpretation, and debate, the simplest emotional impression remains unchanged. The film feels like motion without rest, breath without recovery, and time without relief. The road is still there in the viewer's mind. At this point, the long walk stops being something people just watched and start becoming something they remember in fragments, not as a full story, but as moments. Footsteps on hot asphalt, a sudden silence after conversation, a distant crowd that feels too cheerful for what is happening, and faces that slowly stop looking like they belong to childhood. One of the deeper conversations that emerged after repeated viewing is how the film treats dignity. The walkers are constantly being observed, measured, and reduced to performance under pressure, yet they still try, often unconsciously, to maintain dignity. Even in collapse, there are small attempts to sit properly, speak politely, or help someone else stand. The film suggests that dignity is not something that disappears when people break down. It is something they keep trying to protect even when everything else is gone. This is where the emotional cruelty of the story becomes most visible. The system does not need to strip dignity away forcefully. It simply creates conditions where dignity becomes harder and harder to maintain until holding on to it feels like resistance in itself. Another element that gained attention is how the film handles the idea of witnessing. Every death, every breakdown, every moment of weakness is witnessed by other walkers, by soldiers, and by crowds. Nothing happens in private. This constant visibility changes how suffering feels. It becomes both personal and public at the same time. The walkers are not only enduring pain, they are being seen enduring it. That idea of being seen while suffering became one of the most discussed psychological aspects of the film. Many viewers connected it to modern life online, where emotions, achievements, and even struggles are often performed in public spaces. The film exaggerates that condition into a brutal survival event, but the emotional parallel is clear enough that it sticks. As analysis deepened, people also started focusing on the absence of traditional heroism. There is no character who fully escapes emotional damage. There is no one who remains untouched by the experience. Even those who appear strong at certain points are gradually worn down. This absence of a clean hero structure reinforces the film's core idea. Endurance does not equal victory in any emotional sense. The ending continues to be one of the most debated parts of the entire film experience. Some viewers interpret it as a statement that systems like this are designed so that even survival cannot feel like winning. Others see it as a reflection on how trauma follows people beyond the moment it ends, suggesting that the real continuation of the walk happens in memory. What makes the ending powerful is not only what happens, but what it removes. Emotional certainty is removed, narrative comfort is removed, even the idea of closure is weakened. Instead, the film leaves behind a lingering sense of continuation, as if the story refuses to fully stop. After release, long form discussions and essays began treating the film almost like a psychological case study. Analysts examined group behavior under stress, how alliances form and break, and how individuals adapt when social structures collapse into pure competition. The walkers in this interpretation become a controlled environment for studying human response to extreme pressure. But what keeps the film from feeling clinical is that it never forgets emotion. Even when behavior is being analyzed, the emotional weight remains central. The film never allows the audience to detach fully into observation. It keeps pulling them back into empathy. Another recurring observation is how the film uses exhaustion as a narrative filter. As the walkers become more exhausted, the story itself becomes simpler. Conversations shorten, decisions become immediate, emotional expression becomes raw. It is almost as if exhaustion strips away complexity until only essential human reactions remain. This simplicity is part of what makes the film so heavy. There are fewer distractions from the core experience. Everything unnecessary is gradually removed, leaving only movement, survival, and an emotional residue. Online communities also began creating long threads ranking emotional moments rather than action scenes. People discussed which scenes felt most difficult to watch, not because of violence but because of emotional realism. A quiet moment of hesitation often ranked higher than a dramatic collapse. That shift in attention says a lot about how the film is experienced. As time passed, the movie also started being used as a reference in conversations about endurance in real life, studying working long hours, emotional burnout, or navigating unstable futures. The imagery of endless walking became shorthand for continuing despite internal collapse. This cultural absorption is one of the clearest signs of the film's lasting influence, even its title gained symbolic weight. The long walk stopped being just a literal description and became a phrase people used to describe difficult ongoing experiences. That kind of linguistic adoption usually only happens with stories that connect deeply with shared emotional reality. Another layer of interpretation focuses on isolation. Even though the walkers are physically together most of the time, emotional isolation increases as the film progresses. Communication becomes harder, misunderstandings increase. Emotional transparency decreases. Eventually, each character feels increasingly alone. Even while surrounded by others, this creates a paradox at the heart of the film. Proximity does not guarantee connection. In fact, shared suffering can sometimes increase isolation because everyone is too focused on their own survival to fully reach out. The soundscape reinforces this isolation. As the film progresses, environmental sounds becomes more fragmented. Conversations feel spaced out, background noise becomes inconsistent, silence grows heavier. This auditory design supports the emotional idea that the world is slowly pulling away from the walkers. The film also sparked discussion about pacing expectations in modern cinema. Many viewers admitted they initially expected a faster narrative but gradually adapted to the film's rhythm. Some even described it as a forced recalibration of attention span where viewers had to slow down to emotionally sync with the story. Whether intentional or not, this effect became part of the viewing experience. Despite its heavy tone, the film contains small emotional moments that fans continue to revisit. A shared look between characters, a brief laugh that feels slightly out of place, a moment of silence where someone chooses not to speak. These moments carry disproportionate emotional weight because they feel rare and fragile. That fragility is key to the film's emotional architecture. Nothing emotional is stable, everything can disappear at any moment. That instability keeps the audience emotionally alert throughout the runtime. As interpretations expanded, some viewers began seeing the film as a commentary on systems that reward endurance over well being. In this reading, the walkers are not just individuals in a competition but representations of people inside structures where stopping is punished and continuing is expected. Regardless of cost, this interpretation does not replace others, it sits alongside them. The film's strength is that it supports multiple emotional readings without locking into one explanation. By the time discussions settle into long term analysis, The Long Walk is no longer just remembered for its premise. It is remembered for how it feels to experience it: heavy, repetitive, human, uncomfortable, honest in a way that is difficult to ignore. And even after all the analysis, comparisons, memes, and debates, the final impression remains simple and persistent: a road that does not end, a body that keeps moving, and a silence that never fully leaves. At this stage of discussion, The Long Walk has already moved far beyond being treated as a simple dystopian adaptation. It becomes something closer to an emotional reference point people return to when talking about pressure, endurance, and human limits. The longer the conversation continues around it, the more it seems like the film itself was designed not to end cleanly but to keep unfolding in thought. One of the most persistent ideas in later analysis is the relationship between motion and meaning. The walkers are always moving forward, but the film constantly questions whether that movement actually leads anywhere meaningful. This creates a contradiction at the heart of the story: progress without arrival. The road stretches forward, but it never feels like it is getting closer to anything that matters emotionally. This is where many viewers begin to interpret the film as a metaphor for modern cycles of effort that feel endless: work, study, competition, recovery, repeat. The emotional impact of this idea is subtle but powerful. Instead of showing despair in dramatic bursts, the film builds a quieter feeling of ongoing exhaustion. It is not about one breaking moment. It is about the slow realization that there may be no point where things suddenly become easier. That realization is what makes the film difficult to forget. Another layer that became more prominent in extended discussions is the way the film treats choice. On the surface, the walkers choose to participate, but as the journey continues, the idea of choice becomes less clear. Once the walk begins, stopping is not treated as a real option in emotional terms. The rules erase the comfort of reversal. This raises uncomfortable questions about how much of real human decision making is shaped by invisible pressure rather than genuine freedom. Viewers also began focusing on how identity changes under continuous stress. Early in the film, each character has a distinct personality that is easy to recognize, but as time passes, those identities begin to blur at the edges. Traits become less defined, emotional responses become more similar. The walkers began to resemble each other not in appearance but in emotional exhaustion. This gradual blending of identity is one of the film's quietest but most unsettling transformations. It suggests that under sustained pressure, individuality does not disappear suddenly, it fades through repetition and fatigue. The visual storytelling reinforces this erosion. The road becomes less visually distinct over time, and environmental details feel less important as focus tightens on the walkers themselves. The world does not change dramatically, instead, the perception of it changes. That shift in perception is what creates the feeling of psychological narrowing, as if the universe is shrinking down to just footsteps and breath. Another point that gained attention is how the film handles emotional honesty between characters. As the walk continues, conversations become more direct but also more fragile. People begin saying things they would normally avoid, but they say them in shorter, more exhausted forms. Emotional truth becomes harder to express fully, so it appears in fragments: a sentence interrupted, a half confession, a silence that says more than words. These fragments became some of the most analyzed elements of the film because they feel realistic to emotional collapse in real life. When people are exhausted, communication often becomes incomplete rather than dramatic. The crowd's presence continues to be reinterpreted as well. Over time, viewers notice that the crowd does not remain emotionally consistent. Their reactions shift depending on context. Sometimes they cheer, sometimes they quiet down, sometimes they feel detached. This inconsistency adds another layer of discomfort because it suggests that collective attention to suffering is unstable and shaped by mood, not morality. This ambiguity prevents the film from offering a simple critique. Instead, presents observation. People watch, react, and move on. The psychological progression of the walkers remains one of the most discussed aspects. Early optimism, mid stage adaptation, and late stage emotional depletion form a pattern that many viewers found disturbingly recognizable. It mirrors how people adjust to difficult circumstances in real life. Initial resistance gives way to adaptation, which eventually gives way to normalization of stress. But the film pushes this pattern further until adaptation itself becomes harmful. The walkers do not just adjust to suffering, they begin to live inside it. Music continues to play a quiet but lasting role in audience memory. Even after finishing the film, many viewers recall the emotional tone of certain scenes through fragments of sound rather than visuals. This is because the score is not designed to dominate memory but to attach itself to emotional states. It becomes less of a soundtrack and more of an emotional residue. One of the more philosophical discussions that emerged later is whether the film is actually about competition at all. Some interpretations suggest that competition is just the structure used to reveal something deeper, the human relationship with continuation. Not winning, not losing, but simply continuing forward even when there is no guarantee of meaning. In this interpretation, the walkers are not competing against each other as much as they are competing against stopping itself. The film's influence on online culture also evolved over time. Early memes focused on humor derived from exhaustion. Later, references became more abstract, using imagery from the film to represent burnout, monotony, or emotional fatigue. Eventually, the film stopped being referenced only as entertainment and started functioning as a shared emotional shorthand. This shift is important because it shows how deeply the film embedded itself into audience vocabulary. As discussions stretched further, some viewers began rewatching the film and noticing structural details they missed the first time. Early optimism in dialogue, subtle foreshadowing in behavior, and small visual cues that gain meaning only after knowing the outcome. This rewatch experience often felt even heavier than the first viewing because the emotional inevitability of the story becomes more visible. There is also a growing appreciation for how restrained the film is. It does not over explain its world, it does not pause for exposition, it does not break its emotional rhythm for convenience. That restraint forces the audience to stay inside the experience rather than stepping outside it for explanation. This is part of why the film feels continuous even after it ends. It never gives the viewer a moment to fully detach. By the time long term reflection sets in, the long walk is no longer remembered only as a dystopian narrative. It is remembered as a sustained emotional experience about movement without relief, endurance without certainty, and connection under pressure that slowly dissolves into silence. At this point, continuing to expand the story of the long walk feels less like adding new events and more like circling deeper into the emotional weight it leaves behind. The film, in the way audiences describe it over time, becomes less about what happens on screen and more about what it changes in the viewer's perception of endurance, silence, and human limits. One of the strongest long term interpretations that emerge is how the film treats the idea of forward motion without progress. The walkers are always advancing physically, yet emotionally they are often regressing, losing energy, losing clarity, and losing parts of themselves with every mile. This contradiction creates a psychological tension that viewers keep returning to. How can something be called progress if it feels like continuous erosion? This idea began appearing in discussions far outside film criticism. People used it when talking about studies, jobs, long term stress, and even personal routines. The imagery of walking without arrival became a metaphor people could easily attach to real emotional experiences. That is one reason the film's influence continued growing even after its release period ended. Another recurring point in deeper analysis is how the film removes the possibility of emotional reset. In most stories, characters recover between major events. There is a sense of pause where emotions can stabilize. But in this film, there is no true reset. Even quiet moments carry fatigue from the ones before them. Emotional states accumulate rather than reset, creating a continuous buildup of strain. This accumulation is what makes the film feel heavier the longer it goes on. The audience is never given permission to fully relax, just as the walkers are never given permission to fully recover. The relationship between sound and exhaustion becomes more noticeable in repeated viewings. What initially feels like background design slowly reveals itself as emotional structure. Footsteps are not just rhythm, they become measurement. Breathing is not just sound, it becomes timing. Even silence begins to feel like pressure rather than relief. The absence of sound does not reduce tension, it increases it. Another layer of interpretation focuses on how the film handles time perception. As the walk continues, time loses clarity. Scenes feel longer not because of runtime, but because emotional density increases. A single conversation can feel extended beyond its actual duration because of what it carries emotionally. This distortion of time perception is one of the reasons audiences describe the film as slow but intense at the same time. That contradiction, slow yet intense, became one of the defining descriptions of the experience. The walkers themselves continue to be analyzed as emotional archetypes rather than just characters. Some represent denial, some represent acceptance, some represent anger, and others represent emotional withdrawal. But what makes the film powerful is that these archetypes are not fixed. They shift as exhaustion increases. A character who begins as hopeful may become withdrawn, another who starts aggressive may become quiet. The emotional identities are not stable. They are shaped by distance traveled. This instability reinforces one of the film's core ideas. People are not static under pressure, they are continuously rewritten by it. Another important discussion point is the absence of wasted moments. Even scenes that appear simple or uneventful gain meaning later. A short conversation about home, a glance at another walker, a pause before continuing. These moments accumulate emotional significance because they are not separated by dramatic relief. Everything is part of the same continuous experience. This design choice gives the film a unique rhythm. It does not rely on peaks and valleys. Instead, it builds a steady emotional slope downward, where even small interruptions carry weight. The crowd once again becomes a mirror for interpretation. Over time, viewers began seeing the spectators less as individuals and more as shifting emotional weather, sometimes loud, sometimes quiet, sometimes indifferent. This inconsistency creates unease because it suggests that suffering can be normalized or intensified depending on collective mood. It raises questions about attention itself, how easily it can be directed, sustained, or lost. Some interpretations even suggest that the crowd represents the audience watching the film, not in a literal sense but in the shared act of observing endurance. That reflection makes the viewing experience slightly uncomfortable, which may be part of the film's intention. As analysis deepened, the concept of invisible rules became another point of focus. The walkers are governed by strict conditions, but many emotional rules are not spoken aloud. There are unspoken expectations about behavior, strength, weakness, and social interaction. These invisible rules begin to shape interactions as much as the official ones. This mirrors real life environments where social pressure often matters as much as formal structure. One of the more emotional insights discussed by viewers is how the film handles friendship under impossible conditions. Friendships form quickly because time is limited, but they also become fragile because survival is individual. This creates a constant tension between closeness and self preservation. The result is relationships that feel intense but unstable, meaningful but temporary. The emotional weight of these relationships increases because everyone watching understands they are not protected by narrative safety. There is no guarantee that any bond will last long enough to resolve. Another layer that emerged in long term discussion is how the film treats silence not as emptiness but as memory space. When dialogue disappears, the viewer is left with space to think, imagine, and emotionally process what has already happened. Silence becomes active rather than passive. It forces reflection instead of offering relief. This is one reason the film stays in memory long after viewing. It does not fill every moment with explanation. It leaves gaps that the mind continues to occupy afterward. In broader cultural reflection, the film also began being discussed in relation to endurance culture, how modern life often rewards persistence even when it leads to burnout. The walkers became symbolic of people continuing forward because stopping feels impossible even when exhaustion is overwhelming. This symbolic reading helped the film maintain relevance beyond cinema discussions. By this stage of interpretation, the long walk is no longer just analyzed for its narrative structure. It is discussed as an emotional model, something that represents how pressure accumulates over time when there is no exit point. And perhaps that is why it continues to be revisited in thought long after it ends, because it does not behave like a story that concludes. It behaves like an experience that continues to unfold in memory. The road, in that sense, does not belong to the characters alone anymore. At this stage, the long walk begins to feel less like a film people finish and more like something they mentally step away from slowly. The experience doesn't end with credits, it dissolves. Viewers often describe it as a gradual return to normal life where everyday sounds, walking, and even silence feel slightly different for a while afterward. One of the deeper ideas that continues to emerge in long form discussion is how the film removes the concept of rest as safety. In most narratives, rest is a reward, something characters earn after struggle. Here, rest itself becomes uncertain. Even pauses feel temporary and fragile. The walkers cannot fully trust stillness because stillness is not protected from consequences. This shifts the emotional logic of the entire story. Survival is not just about continuing forward, but about never being allowed to fully stop emotionally. This idea resonates strongly with viewers because it reflects a modern psychological pattern. Feeling like stopping will cause everything to collapse. The film exaggerates this feeling into literal life or death stakes, but the emotional structure underneath is familiar. Another important aspect that grew in interpretation over time is how the film portrays gradual emotional numbness. At first, emotions are sharp, fear is immediate, anger is direct, sadness is visible. But as the walk continues, emotions don't disappear, they flatten. Instead of intense emotional reactions, characters begin to respond with minimal expression. This flattening is not peace, it is depletion, and that difference is what gives the film its long lasting emotional weight. Viewers began to notice that this emotional flattening also affects how they experience the film itself. Early scenes feel emotionally active, while later scenes feel strangely quiet even during tragedy. That shift is not accidental, it mirrors the psychological condition of prolonged stress. Another recurring topic in analysis is the way the film handles uncertainty. In most survival stories, rules eventually become clearer, strategies emerge, and the audience can predict outcomes. In this film, uncertainty never resolves. Even experienced characters cannot fully predict what will happen next. This constant unpredictability keeps both walkers and viewers in a state of alertness that never fully relaxes. This design choice reinforces one of the film's most uncomfortable ideas. Endurance does not create control. The physical environment also continues to gain symbolic meaning in discussion. The road is not just a path, it becomes an endless system that absorbs effort without responding. No matter how much energy is spent, the environment does not change in any meaningful emotional way. The landscape continues to exist indifferently. This emotional indifference is part of what makes the journey feel so isolating. As viewers reflected more deeply, some began interpreting the walker's movement as a loop rather than a line. Even though they are moving forward, the emotional experience feels circular, repeating fatigue, repeating conversations, repeating moments of collapse. This sense of repetition without development creates the feeling that the journey is internally endless, even if it is externally progressing. One of the more subtle elements that gained attention is how the film handles eye contact. Early in the walk, characters look at each other frequently, maintaining social connection. As exhaustion increases, eye contact becomes rarer, shorter, and more hesitant. Eventually, even brief glances feel emotionally loaded. This gradual breakdown of visual connection becomes a quiet indicator of emotional distancing. The film also sparked discussion about how humans assign meaning under pressure. Some walkers try to create personal narratives to survive, telling themselves reasons to continue, imagining outcomes, or assigning meaning to suffering. Others reject meaning entirely and focus only on immediate survival. The film does not declare one approach correct. Instead, it shows both as fragile coping mechanisms that may or may not hold. This ambiguity is part of what keeps the story emotionally open ended. It does not provide philosophical closure about suffering, it simply presents different ways people attempt to survive it. Another layer of analysis focuses on how time between events feels more important than the events themselves. In many films, major moments define structure. In this one, what happens between major moments carries equal or greater emotional weight. Walking, waiting, silence, and continuation become the core structure of storytelling. The absence of dramatic peaks becomes the rhythm itself. This approach changes how audiences process the film. Instead of remembering a sequence of events, they remember a continuous emotional state. The supporting cast of walkers continues to be discussed not just for their individual arcs but for how they function as a collective emotional system. Each character reacts differently to pressure, but together they form a shifting balance of coping strategies. When one weakens, others adjust. When one breaks emotionally, the group dynamic changes. This interconnectedness makes every loss feel structurally significant, not just emotionally tragic. Over time, viewers also began focusing on the film's treatment of hope as something that decays in layers rather than disappearing suddenly. Hope is present early, fragile midway, and nearly invisible late in the journey. But even when it seems gone, it sometimes returns briefly in small moments, only to fade again. This cyclical appearance and disappearance of hope creates emotional instability that mirrors real psychological endurance under stress. Another interpretation that emerged is that the film is structured less like a story and more like a condition. It behaves like an extended state of endurance rather than a sequence of narrative events. That is why it feels difficult to summarize emotionally. It is not remembered as what happened but as what it felt like for a long time. This distinction is what gives The Long Walk its unusual staying power in discussion. It does not rely on plot resolution for impact. It relies on sustained emotional pressure. Even after extended analysis, the film resists final interpretation. It remains open not because it is unclear, but because it is continuous in emotional structure. Every attempt to define it leads back to the same idea: movement without relief, endurance without guarantee, connection under collapse. At this point, continuing to talk about The Long Walk feels like following footsteps that never quite stop echoing. The story stops being about what happens on screen and becomes more about what it leaves behind in perception, like a lingering pressure rather than a concluded narrative. One of the strongest ideas that keeps resurfacing in deeper reflection is how the film redefines endurance as something psychological rather than physical. At first, the walkers appear to be testing their bodies, how far they can go, how long they can last, but gradually it becomes clear that the real test is mental continuity. The body slows down, but the mind keeps being forced to justify each next step. That gap between physical exhaustion and mental persistence becomes the emotional core of the film. This is why so many viewers describe the experience as mentally draining rather than visually shocking. The film doesn't rely on spectacle, it relies on sustained pressure. It builds a sense of inevitability where every moment feels like part of a long decline that cannot be interrupted. Another layer of interpretation focuses on how the film handles attention. The walkers are constantly aware of being watched, but over time, even that awareness changes shape. Early in the walk, being observed feels external, something happening around them. Later, it becomes internalized. Begin to behave as if observation is always present, even in silence. This creates a psychological condition where privacy disappears completely, not because of physical surveillance alone, but because awareness itself becomes constant. This idea has been widely discussed in relation to modern life, where people often feel observed through social structures, expectations, or digital presence. The film intensifies that feeling until it becomes unavoidable. The emotional evolution of the group also continues to be a major point of discussion. At the beginning, relationships are formed quickly and somewhat casually, as if there is still emotional space for normal interaction. But as exhaustion deepens, relationships stop being casual and become essential. Every conversation begins to carry weight, every moment of kindness feels amplified. Yet at the same time, emotional distance grows because survival takes priority over expression. This contradiction, greater emotional importance but reduced emotional expression, is one of the most painful dynamics in the film. Another frequently discussed aspect is how the film treats the concept of distance. Distance is not just physical miles on a road, it becomes emotional separation, psychological detachment, and loss of clarity. As the walkers move forward, they are also moving away from who they were at the beginning. This dual movement, forward in space, away from self, creates a layered sense of transformation. Some interpretations even suggest that the walkers are not simply moving toward an endpoint, but away from an earlier version of themselves that no longer exists once the journey progresses far enough. The film's handling of fatigue continues to be studied in detail. Fatigue is not presented as a sudden collapse but as a gradual rewriting of behavior. Small changes accumulate: slower reactions, shorter speech, reduced emotional range, delayed responses. These subtle shifts create the impression that exhaustion is not an event but a transformation process. Because of this, viewers often find themselves unable to identify a single breaking point for characters. Instead, collapse feels distributed across time. Another important point that emerges in extended discussion is how the film avoids clear moral positioning. It does not instruct the audience on how to feel about participation, survival, or competition. Instead, it shows how morality becomes unstable when conditions are extreme. Actions that feel understandable in one moment may feel questionable in another depending on fatigue, fear, or timing. This moral fluidity forces the viewer into a position of constant reassessment. There is no fixed judgment that remains stable throughout the film. The sound design once again becomes a key part of interpretation in long term reflection. As the journey continues, sound does not simply decrease, it becomes less predictable. This unpredictability creates tension even in quieter moments. The audience begins to anticipate disruption even when nothing is happening. This anticipation itself becomes part of the emotional experience. One of the more subtle ideas that viewers often return to is how the film treats progress as something almost invisible. In most stories, progress is marked by clear milestones or visible change. Here, progress only exists in hindsight. While watching, it often feels like nothing is changing. Only later does it become clear how much has been lost or altered over time. This delayed recognition of change contributes to the film's emotional weight. It mirrors how people often only realize the extent of exhaustion after it has already accumulated. The walkers' emotional relationships continue to be analyzed as fragile systems rather than stable bonds. Trust forms quickly but remains unstable because circumstances constantly shift. Someone who is supportive in one moment may become distant in the next, not out of betrayal but out of necessity. This instability creates a constant emotional uncertainty within the group dynamic. Another theme that continues to emerge is the relationship between individuality and survival. The more the walk continues, the less individuality matters in practical terms. Personal history, personality traits, and emotional distinctions become less relevant to survival outcomes. What remains important is continuation. This gradual reduction of individuality creates an unsettling sense of emotional flattening. Yet, even within this flattening, small gestures of individuality persist, brief comments, subtle reactions, moments of personal expression that resist full erasure. These moments stand out precisely because they are rare. As discussions extend further, the film increasingly appears less like a linear story and more like a sustained emotional condition that viewers temporarily enter. It does not rely on traditional structure to maintain engagement. Instead, it relies on continuity of feeling. This is why the long walk continues to generate reflection long after viewing. It does not leave behind a set of events to analyze, it leaves behind an emotional atmosphere that continues to unfold in memory, and even after all interpretation, discussion, and analysis, the simplest impression remains unchanged. A long path that does not emotionally end when it physically ends. A movement that continues in thought at this point. The Long Walk has almost fully escaped the boundaries of traditional film discussion. What remains is not plot expansion or character tracking, but the way it reshapes how audiences think about endurance itself. The more people revisit it in conversation, the more it turns into a kind of emotional framework rather than a story. One of the final layers that continues to emerge in reflection is how the film treats collapse not as an ending but as a process that begins long before anything visibly breaks. By the time characters appear to be struggling, the collapse has already been happening for a long time in quieter forms, reduced emotional range, shortened responses, delayed reactions, and internal withdrawal. The visible breaking points are just the final expressions of something that has already been unfolding internally. This reframes the entire experience. Instead of watching moments of breakdown, the audience is actually watching the late stages of ongoing erosion. Another important insight that has developed over time is how the film removes the idea of emotional safe distance. In many stories, audiences can separate themselves from suffering because it is clearly framed as fictional and contained. But here, the emotional structure makes distance harder to maintain. The repetition, the silence, and the extended focus on exhaustion create a viewing experience where detachment feels unnatural. This is why many viewers describe the film as something they cannot casually revisit. It demands emotional presence rather than passive watching. As deeper analysis continued, attention also shifted toward how the film handles human adaptation. In most survival narratives, adaptation is portrayed as strength, learning, adjusting, overcoming. In this film, adaptation becomes more ambiguous. The walkers do adapt, but adaptation does not necessarily improve their situation. Instead, it often means adjusting to worsening conditions without resolution. This creates a disturbing idea. Adaptation is not always progress. Sometimes it is just learning how to endure decline more efficiently. This interpretation resonates strongly with modern audiences because it reflects experiences where people adjust to stress rather than escaping it. Another layer of reflection focuses on how the film uses repetition to erase emotional certainty. When actions repeat step after step, conversation after conversation, the emotional meaning of those actions begins to blur. What once felt significant becomes routine. The film slowly transforms extraordinary suffering into repeated experience, which paradoxically makes it even more emotionally exhausting. The walkers themselves continue to be viewed as shifting emotional states rather than fixed characters. One of the most powerful long term interpretations is that each character represents not just a personality but a stage of endurance. Early stage hope, mid stage negotiation, late stage depletion. These stages do not exist separately. They overlap and cycle within individuals as conditions worsen. This fluidity prevents the film from being reduced to simple character arcs. Instead, it becomes a study of emotional transformation under continuous pressure. Another recurring point in discussion is how the film handles absence. Absence of rest, absence of privacy, absence of emotional recovery, and eventually absence of stable identity. But what makes this absence powerful is that it is never announced, it is felt gradually. The audience realizes what is missing only after it has already disappeared. This delayed awareness is part of what gives the film its lingering impact. It trains the viewer to notice loss after the fact, which mirrors how exhaustion often works in real life. The soundscape continues to be reinterpreted as well. In extended reflection, even silence is understood not as emptiness but as compression. It feels tight, like pressure building in the absence of release. This makes quiet scenes feel emotionally dense rather than empty. The longer the film continues, the more silence begins to feel like its own form of intensity. Another widely discussed idea is how the film avoids resolution not only in plot but in emotional structure. There is no point where emotional tension fully resets. Even brief moments of relief are partial and temporary. This creates a continuous emotional curve that never returns to baseline. Because of this, viewers often describe the experience as something that does not end at a specific moment but instead gradually fades out of intensity. The crowd's evolving presence also continues to be analyzed in symbolic terms. Over time, spectators become less about individual reactions and more about shifting collective mood. This shifting presence reinforces the idea that systems of observation are unstable. They change based on attention, fatigue, and emotional distance. The film never fully defines the crowd's role, which allows it to function as a flexible symbol for interpretation. Another key reflection is how the film treats endurance as both achievement and loss. The walkers who continue are seen as strong, but that strength comes at the cost of everything else being stripped away. This creates a paradox. Survival is achieved through gradual reduction of self. The longer someone continues, the less of their original identity remains intact. This paradox is central to why the film feels emotionally heavy even in moments of continuity. Survival itself becomes ambiguous in value. Over time, the long walk also began influencing how viewers describe emotional fatigue in general life. Phrases inspired by the film's imagery, long roads, endless steps, continuous movement, started appearing in everyday language as metaphors for ongoing pressure. This linguistic adoption shows how deeply the film embedded itself into emotional vocabulary. Even its structure continues to be analyzed. The lack of traditional narrative breaks, the continuous forward motion, and the absence of reset points create a storytelling form that feels more like sustained experience than segmented plot. This structure is what makes it difficult to summarize in conventional terms. In the end, what remains after all analysis is not a conclusion but persistence. The film does not resolve into meaning, it disperses into interpretation. Each layer of discussion adds depth but never closure. And so the final impression continues to repeat itself in different forms. A road that never quite becomes shorter, a movement that never fully feels complete, and a quiet emotional pressure that stays even after everything else fades. At this point, there's not really a new direction left in the long walk, only deeper and quieter echoes of what it already set in motion. The film doesn't expand outward anymore in discussion, it folds inward like people trying to understand why something so simple, walking, can feel so heavy for so long. One of the final recurring interpretations that keeps resurfacing is how the film reframes survival itself as something emotionally incomplete. In most stories, surviving is treated as resolution. You reach the end, you win, you escape, you return. But here, survival does not restore anything. It only confirms that something was lost along the way. That makes survival feel less like a victory and more like continuation under changed conditions. This idea becomes especially important when viewers reflect on what after would even mean in this world. The film offers very little sense that there is a clean emotional return point. Instead, it suggests that whatever comes after is already shaped by what happened during the walk. In that sense, the journey does not end when it ends, it extends into everything that follows. Another layer of long term discussion focuses on emotional fatigue as structure rather than theme. The film doesn't just show tired characters, it builds its entire rhythm around fatigue. Scenes don't escalate toward relief, they accumulate toward depletion. This structural choice is what makes the viewing experience feel continuous even when specific events change. Because of this, many viewers describe the film as something that lowers your emotional baseline while watching. It doesn't shock in spikes, it slowly shifts the level at which emotional intensity feels normal. That subtle shift is part of what makes it difficult to immediately transition back into lighter narratives afterward. The walkers, in extended interpretation, also begin to represent a form of emotional timekeeping. Their condition marks the passage of experience more than any external clock. As they weaken, time feels longer. As they lose clarity, moments feel less distinct. The film uses them as living indicators of duration itself, human bodies becoming measures of time under pressure. Another widely discussed idea is how the film removes the possibility of emotional witness recovery. In many stories about suffering, witnessing creates understanding and understanding leads to closure. Here, witnessing does not resolve anything. Characters witness each other's suffering constantly, but this awareness does not lead to clarity or relief. It simply becomes part of the ongoing condition. That lack of resolution after witnessing is one reason the emotional impact lingers. Over time, even small narrative elements begin to feel symbolic. A pause before speaking becomes hesitation in existence. A shared silence becomes mutual exhaustion. A change in pace becomes emotional instability. The film does not assign these meanings directly, but the consistency of tone encourages viewers to build them internally. This internal meaning making is part of why discussions about the film never fully settle. It keeps generating interpretation because it does not finalize its own meaning. Another key reflection is how the film treats individuality as something that slowly becomes less distinguishable under repetition. Not erased suddenly but blurred gradually. Names, personalities, and emotional distinctions start to feel less separated as the journey continues. What remains most visible is not identity but condition. Fatigue becomes the most consistent trait across everyone. Yet, even within this blurring, moments of individuality still break through. A decision, a glance, a hesitation, a small act of kindness or frustration, these brief interruptions of sameness stand out more because they are rare. The film uses scarcity of emotional contrast to amplify meaning. The environment itself also continues to be reinterpreted in discussion as a kind of emotional amplifier rather than a passive backdrop. Roads, distance, weather, and space all respond in the same direction. They extend the feeling of continuation. Nothing in the environment offers emotional resistance or relief. Everything supports the forward motion, even when the characters cannot emotionally keep up with it. This alignment between environment and exhaustion is part of what gives the film its unified emotional tone. Another long term interpretation focuses on the idea of carried experience. Even after characters leave certain moments behind physically, those moments remain emotionally active. The film suggests that experience is not left on the road, it is carried forward internally. This is why even progression feels heavy. Nothing is truly left behind. Everything accumulates. In this sense, the walk becomes less about distance traveled and more about emotional accumulation over time. As reflections deepen further, many viewers begin to describe the film not in terms of scenes or structure, but in terms of sensation, weight, repetition, pressure, silence, movement. These words replace traditional plot summary because the emotional memory of the film becomes more dominant than its narrative outline. This is one of the rare outcomes in cinema where description shifts away from what happened toward what it felt like continuously. At this point in long form reflection, the long walk stops behaving like a film people analyze and starts functioning like a shared emotional reference point for endurance, exhaustion, and persistence without relief. And even after all the interpretation, all the symbolic readings, and all the emotional unpacking, the final impression remains consistent in its simplicity. But a story that ends, but a movement that continues in thought, like a long road the mind keeps returning to long after the body has stopped walking.